온라인 미술시장은 2013년 이후 꾸준한 성장세를 보이고 있습니다. 특히 코로나 팬데믹 이후 비대면과 온라인이 일상화되면서 거의 폭발적이라고 할 만큼 성장했는데요. 이 세션에서는 해외 주요 매체의 미술시장 전문 기자를 초청해 온라인 영역으로 확대된 미술시장과 컬렉터의 변화를 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 아트넷 뉴스의 에디터 팀 슈나이더와 파이낸셜 타임스의 멜라니 게를리스의 발제를 통해 변화의 면면을 살펴보도록 하겠습니다.
Hey everyone, I am Tim Schneider, the art business editor at ArtNet News, and I am here today to talk to you about the online art market, which has both never been more active than it is right now, and which I think is also still hugely misunderstood in some fundamental ways. I want to try to address those misunderstandings by going through what I see as three persistent myths about the online art market and how we can move past them to something that is hopefully better for everyone involved. Now, my interest in and my experience with online sales predates my time of covering it as an art market journalist. I got my start in the art world all the way back in 2005 as a front desk gallery assistant at a contemporary gallery in Los Angeles. And even back then, we were doing some things that would be defined as online sales. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a bit. But what struck me about my time in the online art market back then and what's the state of the online art market now is that less has changed than you might think. So right before the pandemic struck, meaning at the end of 2019, the basic approach or standard approach that most art sellers were taking to online sales basically looked like this. You had about three standard sales channels that people were using. One, they had a dedicated self-run website. Two, they would be on these third-party art discovery platforms, places like the ArtNet Gallery Network or the Artsy Gallery Network or Ocula. And then they would have social media. And in the art world, that primarily means Instagram, though of course there is some activity on some other platforms. Now, between 2005 and 2019, the only real difference is that social media wasn't anywhere near as big a part of really anyone's radar back in the mid-2000s. I mean, Instagram didn't really even exist, actually, when I started in the gallery, which gives you a sense of how much time has elapsed. The reality of using this standard three-pronged online sales approach seemed to be that it put a pretty distinct cap on the size of the online art market. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and the next thing you know, it seemed everything changed almost overnight. So to give you some sense of this, I'm putting on screen a chart that shows the online art sales made at the three big international auction houses, meaning Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips. And what you see here is a modest progression from 2018 to 2019, and then this massive jump between 2019 and 2020. Now, just to put some numbers on it, in 2019, the big three auction houses collectively sold about $95 million in online work. In 2020, they sold over $1 billion in online work. Obviously, that's a 10x jump, which was effectively unheard of in analysis of the online art market. Obviously, you're only seeing 3 years in this chart, but I promise you from the many, many others like it that I've looked at over my time in the art market, if you take it all the way back to 2013 or even maybe a little earlier, you'd still see that same kind of progression, just modest increase year over year, and then boom, 2020 hits and everything just leaps. Now, just to put another kind of perspective on this, it isn't just that there were a higher aggregate number of sales happening or a higher aggregate sales total. in 2020. So the average price of an artwork sold online also had a pretty massive increase. So in 2019, again, sticking with the three big international auction houses, the average price of a work sold online was just short of 11,000 US dollars, or just short of 13 million won. And then in 2020, that number changed to just short of 52,000 US dollars, or about 61 million won. Now, the standard perception of what contributed to this change, aside from the obvious fact that we were all shut up in our houses for an extended period of time, essentially the understanding is that the pandemic fundamentally changed the rules of the online art market. And I actually don't think that that's quite true. Really, what I want to show in this presentation is that what started working online in 2020 was actually working well before the pandemic struck. It's just that the pandemic ended up changing people's behaviors. Basically, the rules of the online art market didn't change so much as people's behavior towards the online art market changed. And that leads us into these three myths that I wanted to talk about. So let's start with the first one. Myth number one, online selling works best for a narrow, low-priced category of artworks. The conventional wisdom for many, many years was that the main thing that sold well online were visually pleasing, very kind of color-saturated, poppy prints made by big-name artists, made in large editions, and sold for around $20,000 or less, ideally. To give you a sense of what that would look like, I'm putting on screen a print from a show that David Zwirner's Online Viewing Room did back in 2017 by Yayoi Kusama. They did an entire show of these prints. They all looked very similar to the one that I have in the slides, and they were all priced between $15,000 and $20,000. Lo and behold, the show sold out, and you can look at that and say, well, that certainly seems to reinforce the idea that the conventional wisdom is correct. Here's the caveat to that. When I did a story in June of 2018 about kind of the state of the online gallery sales sector, Zwirner's representative told me that the gallery had actually sold in its online viewing room works that were priced as affordably as $1,000, but also works that were priced up to $500,000. So keep that in mind as I tell you that the reason I started covering this in June 2018 and writing this particular story about it was that Gagosian launched its first online viewing room timed to the beginning of Art Basel in Switzerland that year. And Gagosian took a very distinct approach to their online viewing room, which flew in the face of conventional wisdom. That approach was that they sold work by only 10 artists, and the lowest priced work that they offered was $150,000. It was a Jeff Elrod painting. They sold that work, and they also sold 4 others, including the most expensive work that they put in their virtual booth, which was an Albert Oehlen painting for 950,000 euros, or about $1.1 million. So all of a sudden, you can look at that and say, well, that's a lot higher than $15,000 to $20,000, and we're talking about unique works too. So maybe the conventional wisdom doesn't hold up quite as well as we thought, but then again, maybe it's an anomaly, right? Well, what Zwirner and Gagosian ended up proving over the course of the next year and a half was that basically it wasn't an anomaly. So Gagosian went on to launch a series of online viewing rooms. One of the next ones that they did was in spring of 2019, and they dedicated their entire online viewing room to a single painting. It was an Albert Oehlen from 1988, and it was priced at $6 million. They sold it within a few hours of opening the online viewing room. And while the gallery would not confirm what the final price was, they would confirm that it was above Oehlen's auction record, which at that point was $4.7 million. Seems pretty good, right? Fast forward to June of 2019, and the next thing you know, David Zwirner comes out and says, hey, guess what? In our online viewing room, we just sold a Jeff Koons Balloon Venus sculpture for $8 million. This is doubly noteworthy because on top of the price, it's sculpture. And part of that conventional wisdom about two-dimensional works selling well is that, well, you can't really sell sculpture because it just doesn't present well online. Nobody is going to go to a web page and look at a three-dimensional object and say, yes, I will pay a high price for that. Lo and behold, Zwirner proved that that wasn't necessarily the case. You might be able to write this off as, well, Zwirner and Gagosian are two of the top galleries in the world. Nobody has better resources. Nobody has a richer clientele. And sure, maybe you can't counter that specifically, but what I would say is that we can't really know because of the fact that there were so few other galleries that were really making a dedicated effort online in that period. One data point about this is that when Frieze launched its first online viewing room to replace the live fair in New York that it had to cancel in May, the head of the fair, or the head of that initiative, said that they had done an internal survey, effectively, of the exhibitors that were set to be at Frieze New York, and out of more than 200 galleries, about 83% of them did not have their own online viewing room at that point. So that really speaks to the idea that maybe the conventional wisdom was in place because of the fact that there just weren't a lot of other people trying to do anything else. And this brings us to this idea that, well, maybe the reason that we thought that all we could sell online were these very attractive, big-name prints at modest prices was because nobody was really trying to sell anything else. So keep that in mind as we move on to myth number 2. Online and offline are two separate sales channels. Now that seems pretty inarguable at first, right? But what I want to argue here is that as soon as you start to scratch the surface of it, that very strict binary starts to fall apart. So let's just ask the question, what do we mean when we say online sales? And I think the average person out there in the art market would probably give you one or all three of these three answers, which is to say that the typical understanding of online sales is that you have online-only auctions, you have sales made through these third-party platforms, again, the ArtNet Gallery Network, Artsy Gallery Network, and now increasingly, you can also say, well, maybe art fair online viewing rooms should also count, and that's fine, I'll take that. And then the third option is sales made directly through social media. And while these are rare, I think, still they are not unheard of by any means. So this is basically just deals that you're striking through, say, your Instagram DMs, through a WeChat conversation, or increasingly, especially if we get into NFTs, the channel Discord. Now, here's the issue that I take with that conception of a strict binary between online and offline sales. Let's look at what the auction houses have done, for starters. So it's become a common practice over the course of the past several years for auction houses to take the works that are going to be in really premier sales and put them on international tour, essentially. So for one example, we just got through a 2-week sales bonanza here in New York. The November New York auctions were back for the first time since 2019. And one of the sales that went up during that cycle was the sale of the Cox collection, which is this trove of impressionist and modern works that was just museum quality all the way through. Now, Christie's, which sold this collection, took it on a 4-city international tour. It started off in Hong Kong, then they took the collection to Taipei, then they took it to Tokyo, then London, and then back to New York where it was on view until it was actually sold there in Christie's New York sales room a couple of weeks ago. The collection sold incredibly well. It went tens of millions of dollars over its estimate. And Christie's announced after the sale that the breakdown of buyers for the works in the sale was essentially split. So you had about half the works going to collectors in the US, and you had about half going to collectors internationally. And some of those collectors who were international were not just bidding remotely, but were bidding online. And that raises an interesting question. Well, if you have an online bidder who wins a work at a live auction, does that count as an online sale? I don't know. Keep that in mind as we go back to, remember that Gagosian Orlin painting that they sold for $4.7 million plus, or the Zwirner online viewing room that had the Koons Balloon Venus sculpture. These are multi-million dollar artworks that are being sold technically online. But how sure are we that the galleries didn't have these works up in their back rooms, say, so that collectors who were potentially interested could come by and take a look and get a sense of them in person? I think it's a fair question to ask. And I'm not bringing this up because of the fact that I think it's suspicious, per se. I just think that it really starts to complicate this idea of online and offline sales channels being very, very different. I'll even speak to a much more fluid type of transaction that I experienced when I was working in the gallery sector. This is just an example, but I think it's pretty representative. So I can think of multiple transactions that essentially went like this. I'm putting a sort of a timeline on screen just to give you a sense. It starts off with an online inquiry, a collector that the gallery doesn't already know. That online inquiry then ends up transforming into a kind of informal meetup at an art fair. Say the collector is inquiring from New York. I was working at an LA gallery. We were showing at the Armory show, and we would arrange with them like, hey, why don't you just come by our booth and we can continue this conversation. That meeting happens, it goes well, then the next thing you know, the relationship moves into a text, calls, occasional video chat kind of moment where you're deepening the relationship. You're maybe sending images back and forth online to get a better sense of what the collector is interested in. Then, lo and behold, down the line, they actually come to a gallery, maybe do a formal sales presentation for them in the back room, and they actually commit to buying one or more works. Now, I think very few people would say, oh, well, that should be considered an online sale. But at the same time, if you weren't online, the sale wouldn't have happened. So how do you make sense of that? I think that the way that you do it is by recognizing that online and offline sales are really less distinct from one another than we think in a lot of ways. I think that more and more of the business and really more and more of our lives ends up sort of moving fluidly back and forth between the online world and the offline world. And if we think about online sales from that perspective, I think it maybe starts to help us figure out a better sense of what might work and what might not work. And that leads us to the third and final myth that I want to get into here, which is this idea that as long as you build an online storefront, buyers will find it. I think that this is a huge misconception. It was a huge misconception before the pandemic. I think it has become an even more insidious one after the pandemic, just because of the sheer level of competition. To give you a sense of how this feels if you're not yourself a collector, I did a story in the fall of 2020 that was basically premised on this idea that collectors were getting burnt out by just the sheer number of online offerings that they were being hit with day in, day out. And a collector that I know pretty well, who's very high level, he's a museum trustee, he described what he was experiencing every day in his inbox as, and I quote, a nonstop onslaught of art. And he told me that the only way that he could try to keep track of things was to start a dedicated folder in his inbox that was just called art. And when he looked at it when we were on the phone, there were 20,000 emails in it. And to hear him talk about it, it was just like the sheer concept of going in there and trying to sort through things was so exhausting that he just couldn't even bring himself to do it. I don't think that that's an anomaly. I think that that's something that a lot of people went through, especially because once the live auction ceased to really be a thing that you could do anywhere in the Western world during 2020, auction houses decoupled themselves from the traditional auction schedule and just started running sales pretty much as often as they felt they could, and that really ramped things up. Art fairs, I would say, did the same thing. You had, for instance, Art Basel running multiple online viewing rooms over and above the live events that they would have had if the year had proceeded as usual. And this was just, again, representative of the fact that when you put that in with all the galleries that were launching online viewing rooms that didn't used to have them, it's just, again, this nonstop onslaught of art. And I think that this becomes even more extreme when you zoom out a little further. The reality is that when you are trying to get somebody's attention online, whether you're an art seller or anybody else, you're also competing with everything else that's online that they could be spending their attention on. I refer to this concept as the tyranny of options. And it basically goes like this. People are now so overwhelmed by choice that, by and large, what they'll end up doing is just defaulting to the few most respected, most widely well thought of brands or presences that are out there. This is why people gravitate to blockbuster movies. It's why in the art world people tend to gravitate towards the mega galleries and the major international auction houses, because it's just hard to go out there and try to find the diamond in the rough gallery or the emerging artist who maybe hasn't even had a particularly noteworthy gallery show yet. And again, when you really think about it and say, well, there are so many more people in the art world who are online, and there's now so much else online. If you're asking someone to go to your online viewing room, you're also asking them to turn away from things like memes, the new pop music that just came out that they're super interested in. Maybe there's a movie or TV show that they could watch. Maybe they're into fashion and they just want to do some online shopping. Like, all of these things are things that they now have to turn away from to want to go online and look at your gallery, your auction house, your artwork if you're an artist. And that means that just saying, oh, well, I have an Instagram page, or oh, I have a website, or oh, I have an online viewing room, that's enough. I don't think it's enough. Jia Fei, who now runs, as far as I know, the art world's only digital strategy consulting firm, described it to me like this back in the spring of 2020. She said that when you're talking about an online space, it's about more than building a space, it's about building a conversation around it. And to give you an example of how that works, I want to talk about a gallery called Unit London. Now, Unit London has been around since 2013. They started off as a sort of grassroots, pop-up based gallery in the London area. And between 2013 and 2018, they leveled up to having a very posh, sort of very refined white cube space in the Mayfair district, which I'm sure most of you know is where you also have the likes of Zwirner and Gagosian and Hauser's London outfits. Now, what makes Unit interesting is that they managed to make this leap without ever showing at an art fair. And the reason that they were able to make this sort of unorthodox leap is that they went into the gallery starting off from the very beginning as saying, we are going to try to build a digital community. We are going to treat online engagement as the coin of the realm in a lot of ways. And everything that we do is going to be thought of through the lens of how does this translate online, as opposed to, well, we know we should have some kind of online presence, let's just bolt it on at the end. What Unit ultimately ended up doing right before the pandemic, I should say, by that point, they had a dedicated content team of 4 people, which is more than a gallery of their size would have, really, unless they were a blue chip style gallery. And again, those galleries are larger than Unit London was, anyway, from a staff and resources standpoint. The point is that they really believed that if they weren't actively responding to people online, if they weren't creating conversations, if they weren't giving people a real sense of why they should be looking at what Unit was up to, those people probably weren't going to be particularly interested. And again, it kind of goes back to that tyranny of options idea. And I think that ultimately what you can end up bringing out of that is that if you think back to the idea of online and offline not necessarily being separate channels, it is really about unifying everything, really treating the online world with as much of a sense of dedication and importance as you would the offline world. I think that that's a lot, so let's just recap for a second. And in fact, let's revise those three myths. So, number one, online selling is best for a narrow, low-priced category of work. I think that we have now seen that you can throw that out. The revised myth would be, or I should say, the revised fact, is that online selling can work for any artwork at any price point. Brings us to myth number two, online and offline are two separate sales channels. Throw that one out too. The revised reality is that most art sales, or at least many art sales now, flow across multiple channels and should be treated as things that need to be sort of coaxed through multiple phases, as opposed to there's a way to do this online, we're just going to focus on that. Third and final myth, as long as you build an online storefront, buyers will find it. Again, chuck that one in the trash. The revised reality is that engagement drives discovery and sales. And if you're not finding a way to go out there and engage a digital audience, then they're probably not going to just find you by happenstance and love what you're doing enough to make you a part of their lives and their bank balances. You know, that's a lot to think about, but I think that if you can sort of keep all those ideas in mind and find your own particular solutions to them, it will go a long way towards helping you find more of a foothold in the gallery world or the auction world or just as an independent artist. Sorry, there's a siren going by. It's streets of New York, you gotta love it. Anyway, I'll end it there. Again, I'm Tim Schneider, art business editor at ArtNet News. You can read me every week on ArtNet News Pro. If you want to follow me online, my Instagram account is @the_gray market, and I'm on Twitter @the_gray_market. Thanks again for your time. Hope some of that was helpful. Enjoy.
Hi, thank you so much for joining. I'm Melanie Gerlis, a UK-based art market author, writer, and columnist for the Financial Times and the Art newspaper. I'm delighted to share with you my thoughts on how our new online existence, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, has brought new art and new buyers into the art market, what I call Collector Trends 2.0. To begin with, I think it's helpful to look at the wider context of how the art market has fared these past couple of years. COVID, as everyone says, has accelerated everything. In the art market, that is true too. It's been very, very sharp, as if 10 years or possibly more of progress was squeezed into one. It was a huge shock in many ways, but the art market seems to have come through. Why? Well, mostly because, like it or not, the rich have got richer. Globally, this is true, but notably among millennials, so people aged between 23 and 38, women who have done pretty well, and the fast-growing wealth through much of Asia. This wealth has met a market that had to adapt to the way that younger, faster people in particular like to shop. It went online and went higher tech after much resistance through the years. And luckily, people wanted to buy art. This was not a given. At times of crisis, sometimes maybe art is the last thing on your mind, but it seems to have been very popular, and the only way to buy it was virtually. With this younger, faster audience, other trends accelerated. There's much more transparency now. For example, if I went to an art fair in real life 2 years ago and wanted to get the price of something, I would have to ask very nicely. Some people might give it to me, some people wouldn't. I've certainly spent a lot of the years of my life as a journalist trying to get prices out of people. Now, on the online viewing rooms, the websites that replaced art fairs, prices were there, or at least a price range. And of course, there's greater accessibility in other ways. Suddenly, everyone could go to an art fair, and it was free. You didn't have to fly in from anywhere or stay in an expensive hotel or pay the sometimes quite high entrance fee to a fair. The art world has been gradually getting more accessible over the past decades, particularly through art fairs since the turn of this century. But suddenly, the whole world was a potential art buyer. The important thing about this accessibility as well is that it meant you could be anonymous. You're behind a computer screen. I think that's been incredibly important in a world that can seem very elite and judgmental. At the same time, cryptocurrencies, blockchain platforms found their moment, and art backed by non-fungible tokens, NFTs, really began to take off. What was happening in this code-based techie world seemed much more exciting and dynamic than looking at lots of pieces of flat, still art on a computer screen. This is why in this presentation you'll hear more about NFT-based art than other digital-based art. Because of such excitement and accessibility, new buyers entered our market. What are these buyers like? Well, they're younger, of course, but remember that millennials go up to the age of 38, so they're not babies. These are people with real monies, real jobs, real taste, real opinions. And, according to the latest Art Basel and UBS report, the biggest spenders on art. This report found that in 2020, 30% of millennials spent more than $1 million on art during the year, and that their median spend was $228,000, much higher than any other age group. A lot of millennial money is self-made, rather than inherited as it had been in the past, by people who are used to choice when they're ordering food or buying clothes, and they want choice when it comes to looking at and purchasing art. They're not going to go to galleries necessarily or to art fairs. Dealers have to come to them. We've seen that physically in the past couple of years. There are a lot more pop-up spaces in cities such as Aspen and Monaco, and also galleries, dealers, auction houses, everyone who is trying to sell art has had to be a lot more creative on social media and so on. The new buyers are still from some of the more traditional financial world, but they are crypto savvy. They move very fast, and, as has always been true of new money, they are craving something new. They want to break with the past. My colleague Tim Schneider, who writes for ArtNet, went recently to the NFT NYC conference, and he quotes someone there describing the crowd as a parallel universe to the stately art world. I'm not sure for art it's a completely parallel universe, as you will see, but certainly one major difference is how public buyers now are, especially on Twitter and Discord, a gaming platform, which seem to be the platforms of choice. Again, a little bit like prices, the identity of a seller and a buyer have always been really huge secrets in the art world, which loves its privacy. But look here, you have Christie's, an 18th century French-owned old-style auction house, tweeting the usually very secret identity of the buyer of the famous Beeple that sold for $69.3 million online on March the 11th. I doubt it was Christie's idea. Meta Coven, the buyer, and about who we will hear a bit more, he will have wanted it, and in fact, he retweeted it. As you can see here, it got 1,500 likes. This is the new market. Meta Coven is, I think, a good case study in the motivations of buyers of NFT art in particular. His real name, as became apparent after the Beeple purchase, is Vignesh Sundaresan. He is a Chennai-born tech consultant who got into cryptocurrencies early and founded the fund Metapurse. His avatar is this picture you can see on the left, a work by Silvia Vieira called Contemplation of Creation that Metakoven, or Vignesh, owns. And we can see on Super Rare that he bought it for 0.45 Ether 2 years ago, which at the time was worth about $100 and now is worth about $1,800, simply because of the currency gains. His name, Metakoven, means King of the Metaverse, and in a very revealing interview with the Financial Times by Stefania Palmer, its Singapore correspondent, which I highly recommend you read, he was, I thought, incredibly interesting about the conflict between smashing the traditional barriers of the art world and wanting to belong to the traditional art world. I think this underpins the role of NFT in the art market just now. In the interview, he says of his anonymity that the avatar removed all the judgments and put my work first before people could meet or judge me. He's using the word judge twice. Maybe they thought I was white. I don't know. What was possible with his online buying and with the NFT market was to bypass the judgment he has obviously felt exists, and we have seen it exist with galleries picking and choosing the people who are allowed to buy from them. But also, he says, now everyone wants me in the cap table. The cap table is a group of people who sit around a table and they look at a spreadsheet and they're allowed access early on to some of these high-tech startup funds. He wants to belong. The final quote is fascinating too. It's the NFT that changed the world of the Beeple 5,000 days. You cannot put a number to it. He wants to make history. He absolutely did make history. But that has been the motivation for art buyers for centuries, to want to belong, to make a change, to use art to get to the top of the tree. So how different is our world now? Firstly, we have to remember that things are beginning to come back to real life, and that the art market intermediaries, the auction houses, the galleries, the dealers, the art fairs, they need the world to come back. This is their business. But they need NFTs. They certainly need the NFT buyers. Suddenly, digital art is a part of auction houses, gallery shows, and art fairs too. Both are benefiting from each other. The NFT market, which is still a little bit of a wild west, gets validation as art, and also through the legal checks and balances that a big auction business has to comply with before they sell anything. This is not necessarily in keeping with the more democratic ambitions in the open market, which creates some tension. But, as I've said, the tension between keeping art elite and opening it up to the masses has long been there. NFTs are definitely helping the traditional market too, as buyers move from digital NFT art into heavyweight physical art. So here we can see in a tweet, of course, by Justin Sun, the founder of the Tron cryptocurrency, who was born in China. It seems that he started his art buying with pack cubes, which were offered at Sotheby's and priced up to $1,500 each in April. Then in June, he changes to an untraditional but physical work of art by Cause, which he bought in Hong Kong, again at Sotheby's, for 2.5 million Hong Kong dollars, which is about 300,000 US dollars. Then just now, in November, he bought one of the most expensive items in the mega auction of the Maclo collection at Sotheby's, Giacometti's Linné, an incredible, important work of art for which he paid $78.4 million. The auction houses need him too. But I think a bit of a reality check is in order. we are learning to love seeing art in real life again. Online buying is just another way to buy. You can buy over the phone, you can buy over email, you can buy online. Seeing art, having an experience, is still very different. NFT works are super exciting but very hyped, and we are seeing prices go shoot up, shoot down, and get to levels that really no one can explain or justify yet. The NFT world is also not just about art. It is arguably more about music, gaming, sports, finance, of course. So I think art is a very small part of what is going on in the wider NFT crypto world. It's also more correlated with traditional investments than some buyers would like. NFT art soars in value or in price when Ether soars, the cryptocurrency Ether, and that makes Bitcoin, the original cryptocurrency, soar, and when Bitcoin goes up in value, its owners, who are also owners in equities, so traditional shares, also go up. It's not really a hedge against other investments in the same way as some believe physical art is. There's also the ongoing question of how much we need the gatekeepers and intermediaries, the dealers, the writers, everyone in but the curators. I would argue that with so much more out there, and all so wild and different and changing so fast, we need some sort of validating systems. And that artists as well might say they want to go straight to their buyers, but they need some protection. Another serious problem that I see is that while there should be plenty of opportunity for emerging, younger, ethnically diverse artists, the available data so far shows that NFT sales are still dominated by the Western art market centres, and the most successful artists are still white men. It is also, as I've said, a very volatile market. For now, the most sustainable beneficiaries seem to be physical art by rebellious artists, such as Basquiat and Banksy, while digital art, which has long been on the margins, is clearly also benefiting, which is great news. This is why I've called this presentation Collector Trends 2.0. We're not seeing a complete reinvention of collectors, we're seeing a shift into a new direction. And it is important to remember that quite a lot of traditional collectors are enjoying dabbling in the digital and NFT world. It is, as I've said lots of times, an area that is moving very fast, and that makes it very difficult to predict, of course, but I'm going to try. Firstly, some of the logistical hurdles to online buying in general are improving. There was a time when people were too frightened to buy food online or clothes, and gradually the price points are getting higher and higher. There are lots of lawyers working around the clock to establish global rules while also respecting regional laws, national laws, and looking at the wider online sales structures. NFTs in particular are not so easy to jump into, but there's plenty of work being done to make it easier for people to exchange between fiat, traditional currencies, and cryptocurrencies. And there are some responsible galleries and educational establishments aiming to demystify online, which helps us all. I would highly recommend Unit London, a gallery here in the UK. Their website, whose name I've put there, they have everything on it from what is an NFT to how to buy an NFT, and of course, they have their own NFT platform. There are also well-documented problems with the carbon footprint involved in making an NFT. But new platforms are being developed to overcome this, and this will be extremely important in an increasingly environmentally aware world. I think that this existing conflict between democracy and validation will result broadly into two markets. One of them can be the Wild West, and we can have volatility and maybe a bit more fun. The other one will be more similar to ours. We will co-opt what we need and what we can take. I think it might account for about 10% of the global art market, but others disagree with me. I had one NFT artist tell me this week he believes that in 2 years the whole market will be NFT backed. It's up to you to decide. But what is certainly true is that what was a very niche, elite, high barrier to entry market has widened out considerably because of the moves online during the pandemic. As David Zwener, a mega gallerist, said to me, we all need to be much more open-minded. There's a much bigger art world out there than we thought. This isn't going to go away. Thank you also so much for listening. If you have any questions, please do email me. My details are there. And I've also put a plug for my new book, which has been published this month and is available as an ebook. Please keep in touch. Thank you.